Hi, this is Andy Hoffman, Marketing Director of Miles Franklin Precious Metals in our 26th year in business. It's Wednesday evening, February 18th, 2015, and the title of today's audio blog is The Fed Flat Out Lied and Everyone Knows It. Okay, I'm going to try to make today's audio blog short and sweet, at least in relation to prior ones, although we'll see just how short when the final timestamp is tallied. To start, I'll discuss the ongoing Greek saga briefly, as one way or the other, it must come to a head before the current February 27th deadline. After all, the current $285 billion bailout agreement, which by the way comprises more than half of all Greek debt, expires on February 28th. Frankly, the Eurogroup faces the ultimate Hobson's choice, as whether it does nothing, i.e. allows Greece to technically renege on its debt, demands a new round of nation-destroying loans, or expels Greece from the euro entirely, the ramifications will be anywhere from ugly to catastrophic. And the same goes for Greece in playing chicken with not only the lives of its citizens, but hundreds of millions of Europeans. Practically speaking, Greece must renege on its debts, the sooner the better, as they have become so unpayable it's almost laughable. Clearly the nation is on the verge of collapse, which is why they voted Syriza to power. And thus, don't for a second believe the propaganda that an agreement, whatever agreement that might be, is imminent. It is decidedly not, and anyone betting otherwise may well receive a spiritual financial experience. And yes, I get it, the all-powerful bankers have thus far dodged similar bullets, and thus the thinking goes they'll manage to get Alexis Tsipras and Yanis Varoufakis to bend to their will, despite angry escalating rhetoric from both sides. I mean, the market is telling us so by rising, so what could go wrong? I'll tell you what, reality, the reality of economic Mother Nature, the reality of the Greek people's will, and the reality that unless Greece escapes its yoke, it will forever be the debt colony Varoufakis vowed to escape from. There's a reason why, nearly 2 years after I deemed Greece my top pick to catalyze the big one, and now more than ever I believe that to be the case, if not now, then shortly thereafter. As for the Ukraine, wow, it was a whopping 5 days before the ceasefire I vociferously mocked fell apart, as frankly it strains the logic of nearly all sentient beings to believe that Germany, which recently spearheaded nasty sanctions against Russia without any material evidence of wrongdoing, and France, which has absolutely zero military or economic credibility, could force Vladimir Putin to do anything, let alone during the winter when Putin could cut off a significant source of natural gas imports at the snap of a finger. In other words, what we warned of in last year's "this is what we do," it's coming to fruition, slowly but surely. And while no one knows exactly how the Ukrainian crisis will resolve itself, the one thing we're sure of is it's not going to do so anytime soon, as without question the Crimean Peninsula, representing the only friendly warm water port on Russia's western front, is second only to the Middle East in terms of geopolitical hotspots. Like a pit bull, Putin has his jaws clenched around what he believes is rightly Russia's, which, by the way, it is, given that last year Crimean citizens voted to rejoin Russia. And trust us, he won't let go unless it's over his cold dead body. Just yesterday, one of Germany's top political leaders warned that a full-scale war was possible, which is probably why America sent over a fleet of tank-busting aircraft this morning. Ceasefire indeed. And then there's that massive West Coast dock worker lockout, which, despite the MSM's best efforts to ignore, is both real and significantly economy threatening. And this in an economy barely a notch above rock bottom, despite what last week's criminally fraudulent NFP employment report, which I discussed in Employment American Style, told us. Whether or not it gets resolved, we'll have to wait and see. However, if a nation already sporting contracting retail sales, factory orders, construction spending, consumer and small business sentiment, housing starts and permits, and countless other segments is forced to deal with a crippling supply breakdown, first half GDP numbers could well redefine the term negative. And unlike last year's polar vortex, even the nation's top propagandists won't be able to convince America that this is a non-recurring event, let alone the liars at the Fed who continue to pretend we're recovering by falsifying economic data, printing endless trillions covertly, and spearheading the broadest, most blatant market manipulation scheme of all time. But more on the Fed in a second, after I discuss the breaking news as I write at roughly 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time of the utterly massive API crude oil inventory build just announced, utterly shattering any and all estimates. But before I get to it, I want to address a comment that I received today that I brag too much about being right about predictions, whilst ignoring the fact that precious metal prices have declined irrespective. The writer, a very nice gentleman who I subsequently made my peace with, claimed that as a quote newsletter writer, my predictions were harming his portfolio, and thus I should tone down my bravado. Well, first of all, with all due respect, I don't think anyone that knows me would describe my writings as boasting, as not only am I quite humble, but the gold cartel has significantly humbled me over a long, long period of time. Frankly, if it weren't for the coincidental timing of buying my home in May 2007, i.e., literally the top of the junior mining market, the sheer luck that the mining stock I doubled down on at the bottom of 2008 crisis rebounded sharply, which, by the way, was Silverstone Resources, and the best decision I ever made to sell all my miners in May 2011 and put the proceeds into physical metal, I wouldn't be here writing this blog. That said, the cartel has caused me untold financial and mental misery for more than a decade, which thankfully Miles Franklin has given me an outlet to respond with. Remember, the Miles Franklin blog is decidedly not a newsletter writing service. To the contrary, David Scheckman, Bill Holter, and myself provide a free educational blog in which we, of course, promote the product we sell, but equally importantly for anyone that knows us, to disseminate economic truth. We are not financial advisors and do not give recommendations, that is, other than to protect yourself from the final phase of history's largest fiat Ponzi scheme, which thousands of years of empirical evidence tell us can be best done with physical gold and silver. Actually, I've in fact made one recommendation in my 3.5 years at Miles Franklin, and done so from the top of my lungs no less, which has been, presciently so, to beware of paper PM investments like mining shares, ETFs, and closed-end funds. Not that you aren't free to speculate to your heart's content. However, the reason we own physical gold and silver is not to speculate, but to save our hard-earned money in the only asset class that cannot default or be debased. Not to mention that after having worked in the mining industry for nearly 5 years, no one was better versed into how treacherously difficult the business was, or for that matter, the naked shorting. Since I've joined Miles Franklin, the mining stocks have been utterly annihilated, as have the premiums, now discounts, on the closed-end bullion funds. And as I write, the mining Armageddon I spoke of last month is going on in full force. To that end, I'll update you shortly on the cumulative results of mining earnings, which will be in full view tomorrow when the world's largest gold miners report earnings. I continue to forecast industry paralysis to take hold as the year progresses, and with it the spreading realization that gold and silver production have nowhere to go but down. Which, of course, is the polar opposite of what is going on in the all-important crude oil market, per what I've written in countless articles over the past 2 months, most notably January 2nd's direst prediction of all, and oh yeah, yesterday's supply response, which is that no matter how much propaganda is spewed of a potential V-shaped bottom in crude oil prices, which in my mind the U.S. government is desperately attempting to create via blatantly obvious futures purchases, an utter swarm of supply is hitting the market on a daily basis and won't stop anytime soon. And this amidst a global economy in, for all intents and purposes, free fall, with the outlook for a material rebound slim to none. Again, I'm not going to rehash this commentary here, other than to say that there's no way in hell OPEC allows insolvent shale oil producers to steal its market share, as not only is it on the verge of permanently destroying the net that Wall Street junk bond financed high-cost shale oil producers have become, but because its own socialist spending plans were based on significantly higher oil prices, they need the money as desperately as said shale producers. As I write, oil has plunged from $53 this morning to $50.50 this evening, and unless tomorrow's EIA inventory report, the one with the 80-year high crude oil inventories, unless it provides a miracle, the powers that be's best efforts to goose oil higher will likely be dead and buried, with last month's lows firmly in economic Mother Nature's crosshairs. And if that in fact occurs, undoubtedly taking the CRB index to new lows as well, today's all-time largest PPI plunge will look like the good old days. Which brings me to today's primary topic of how today's FOMC minutes, once and for all, prove that what I've said all along, which is that the Federal Reserve are unabashed liars about not only what they do in covertly manipulating markets, but what they say. I mean, I thought they had lost any remaining credibility they had when at their December 17th meeting, Whirlybird Janet deemed the historic, fundamentally based oil price plunge and unnamed, quote, other factors to be transitory. That is, until the January 28th meeting, which, as discussed in my FOMC Lunacy Opens the Gates of Hell audioblog, they had the gall to completely ignore everything from further oil price declines to European QE, the burgeoning Greek crisis, the Swiss franc debacle, and a cascading Baltic dry index, which, by the way, hit a new all-time low today. To that end, here's what I stated in said audioblog from January 28th. Based on one of the ugliest economic, financial, and geopolitical months in memory, the FOMC had little, if any, ability to credibly maintain its now 3-year lie about economic recovery, as objectively not only is the U.S. economy crumbling, but the entire world. Which is why I expected at least a modicum of humility in their statement, if you will, a Yellen reversal light, citing plunging oil and commodity prices, currencies, and economic data as reasons to at least be cautious going forward. Again, the Fed only takes action when the PBT loses control of the stock market, which is why neither I nor anyone else expected even a hint of discussion about contemplated easing measures. However, it's one thing to lie about your actions, and another entirely to completely ignore reality, which is exactly what the FOMC did, despite the entire economic world crumbling around them. Well, none of that chicanery holds a candle to what they pulled this afternoon in demonstrating that either the January 28th testimony was a lie, told in collusion with the BLS, which a week later reported the most egregiously fanciful employment report in history, or perhaps, as I have suggested for years, said minutes of the meeting were doctored to account for subsequent events. Again, it's either one or the other, per logic that Mr. Spock himself couldn't dispute. To wit, the Fed's maniacal goal of pushing through a measly quarter-point rate hike at some point later this year, albeit in patient fashion, has caused Janet and friends to go hog wild in manipulating markets and economic data and continuing to ignore the reality that said all-time low in the Baltic Dry Index purports, not to mention plunging commodities, currencies, and economic data, both here and overseas. Even island of lies economic data like jobless claims and fabricated diffusion indices are rolling over, as well as consumer sentiment, small business sentiment, and even home builder sentiment. To that end, yet another raging stock market rally this month via the identical algorithms we have witnessed every day for years, based on absolutely nothing but PPT buying. Not to mention yet another interest rate surge despite rates all over the world going the opposite direction, as appears to occur every time the FOMC prepares to make a statement, or for that matter, releases minutes of meetings held a month prior. The reason, of course, is to prevent widespread realization of what I wrote in last May's most damning proof yet of QE failure, i.e., plunging rates despite the so-called recovery the Fed reports. To that end, I have in past articles painstakingly detailed how every time such a meeting occurs, rates immediately fall back down, which care of the aforementioned oil price data, and oh yeah, today's all-time largest monthly plunge in the PPI inflation index, or should I say deflation index. It's hard to believe last month's low of 1.65% in the benchmark 10-year Treasury yield won't be revisited in the coming months. Or if things get bad enough, in Greece, the Ukraine, or some other economic or geopolitical hotspot, perhaps significantly sooner. And then you have today's minutes, which once again, I'm telling you, is the biggest farce in the entire corrupted U.S. monetary system, as theoretically, not a shred of incremental data should ever emerge, given that the consensus of said meeting is not only discussed in the policy statement that comes out directly afterward, but countless speeches by the various Fed presidents in the ensuing weeks. However, in this case, The minutes miraculously purported last month's FOMC discussions to be decidedly more dovish than the aforementioned lie purported by the statement, in pretending the members were not worried about a crashing global economy and extremely volatile geopolitical situations in Greece, the Ukraine, and countless other nations with crashing currencies, like, for instance, Brazil, Russia, Turkey, South Africa, Nigeria, and Indonesia. The reason for this change, of course, is the Fed is terrified of even pretending to be considering rate hikes under such conditions, let alone after seeing the housing starts, sentiment, and permits, as well as mortgage and refinancing applications, collapse after just 2 weeks of modest interest rate increases. Throw in the end of the oil dead cat bounce, the potential for the Eurozone to collapse, the end of the Ukrainian ceasefire, the plunging Baltic Dry Index, and outside the fabricated January NFP report, utterly abysmal U.S. economic data, and clearly the Fed realized that the time to feign indifference was past. And voila, an extremely dovish set of minutes, which frankly you'd have to be brain dead to believe were not doctored, featuring bullet points such as, many Fed officials inclined to stay at zero longer. Many Fed officials felt dropping patient may lead to date focus. Many Fed officials saw risks if foreign weakness worsened. Fed officials agreed policy should stay data dependent. I mean, just how stupid do they think the entire world is in spewing such Fed speak drivel, completely contradicting what they purported in the policy statement from that very meeting? Frankly, I can't wait to see what Whirlybird Janet says at next week's semi-annual Humphrey Hawkins Congressional Senate testimony. As if the Fed is truly data dependent, she's likely to be facing Congress in an extremely dovish economic backdrop. Remember, the Fed will do anything in its power to have its public appearances, quote, supported by favorable economic data and manipulated financial market movements. However, with the global economic and geopolitical walls rapidly closing around them, it's only a matter of time before the inevitable Yellen reversal, in which she admits the U.S. economy needs more stimulus, arrives. As for precious metals, which tonight received a significant boost by news that India repealed its ban on bank imports of gold and silver, which could be turbo boosted on February 28th if the Indian government, as expected, repeals the onerous 10% gold and silver import tariffs, there's not a doubt in my mind that the past 2 days' vicious cartel raids, including today's 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time blitzkrieg attempt to breach $1,200 an ounce, were due to the Fed knowing this dovish statement would be released, thus enabling gold and silver's subsequent rebound to commence from a lower level. Trust me, after watching them for 13 years, this is standard operating procedure. Well, gold's rebound, of course, was capped, but as I write at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, it's up to $12.18 per ounce and silver $16.80 per ounce. And oh yeah, the 10-year Treasury yield has plunged from 2.17 this morning to 2.07, likely about to join oil prices in a trip to the financial sub-basement. In other words, the deflationary nightmare I wrote of in January 2nd's direst prediction of all is likely to reassert itself in full force. And this time around, the lying Fed's ability to avert economic Mother Nature's anger with money printing, market manipulation, and propaganda will be severely challenged, if not completely disabled. Consequently, the protection of your hard-earned